The long-awaited Sony A7S Mark III is finally here, and these are my thoughts on using it to shoot real estate video and also how it stacks up against my Panasonic GH5. Hi, I'm Grant, and with the release of the new Sony A7S Mark III, I approached Sony New Zealand, who kindly agreed to lend me this one for a test and review. Now, for those of you not familiar with the Sony A7S series of cameras, their main party trick, which is particularly applicable to real estate styles of videos, is their fantastic low light shooting capabilities. However, before getting into the nitty-gritty of this video, I just wanted to say that when watching reviews such as this one, and reviewers such as me in this instance, we have our own preferences and biases when using cameras, depending on what we use them for and our experience level, so just take what we say with a pinch of salt. And also, when you start getting into these prosumer or semi-professional cameras, you actually really have to live with them for quite some time to really dial into using them and discovering their full potential. And in this instance, I have got the Sony A7S III on loan for 10 days, whereas I've had my Panasonic GH5, which I'm shooting this on now, for over 2 years, and I still discover things on that camera that I tweak and use to get the most out of it. I thought a good way to frame the content of this video would be what factors I look for if I'm in the market to purchase a new camera, and the two main ones being image quality and usability or form factor of the camera. Firstly, here are some of the video specs of this new Sony A7S Mark III, which I consider to be important. It can shoot 4K video up to 120 frames a second internally. Now that is pretty amazing. It can record 10-bit 422 video internally. It has a dual ISO function, which gives it the amazing low light capability, which I will talk about later. It has Sony's 5-axis steady shot image stabilization. It now has a flip out LCD monitor as opposed to a previous flip up monitor. It has dual memory card slots. It has Sony's full range of picture profiles, including S-Log2 and S-Log3. And it has Sony's new image sensor or color science. Now, obviously the Sony A7S Mark III has all the video functionality, or ticks all the boxes that you could want in a camera, and especially the one now which is lacking on some of the older cameras is 4K 50 or 60 frames a second recording, especially if you want to use your camera shooting on a gimbal for real estate video. Now, image quality can be a bit of a tricky variable to judge, so I've found the best way is to compare it against what I already know. And in this case, I put the Sony A7 III directly against my Panasonic, I almost said Sony, my Panasonic GH5 in a controlled setting, and I locked down all the manual settings that I could on the camera, including its ISO, its white balance, shutter, and aperture. I also shot both cameras in 4K 10-bit 422 internal recording, and I shot the Sony with its S-Log3 profile, and I shot my Panasonic GH5 just in its slightly modified Cine D profile, which is the profile that I prefer and use. Now, on the Sony, I used the very good Sony 16-35 f2.8G lens, and on my Panasonic I had my trusty 8-18 lens, which both have almost identical focal length ranges. Now, obviously the image quality out of both these cameras is excellent, and the surprise here though is how well my 3-year-old GH5 stacked up against the Sony A7S Mark III. To my eye, there is actually very little in it. You can see in some of these shots that the S-Log3 on the Sony retained a little more detail in the highlights, but not as much as I was expecting. Now, this could also be due to my skill or lack of when shooting and editing S-Log on the A7 III. Now, I thought about shooting in Vlog on my Panasonic GH5, but from past experience I didn't like it, and I find it has quite a hard color cast that I have trouble editing, so I went with what I know and use the most, and that is the Cine D profile. Now, this brings me to the variable that tripped me up a little, and that is shooting and editing using S-Log3 on the Sony. It actually took me quite a while of fiddling and dialing into trying to expose correctly using the S-Log3 profile on the Sony. So I had to play with the zebras and using the histogram, and it actually took me 5 days to discover that there is actually a gamma assist function built into the Sony which you can turn on, which almost puts a LUT over your LCD monitor to make it easier to get a more natural look when trying to set exposure using S-Log. And this also helps because it gets rid of the very grey and milky look that you get on your monitors when shooting an S-Log. And another result I found shooting with the Sony is that I actually found it better to color grade the S-Log footage using Final Cut Pro X from scratch rather than applying a Sony LUT, which brings it back to the Rec 709, because I found that just by applying the LUT to the raw Sony S-Log footage, it actually I lost some of the highlight detail and I actually got better results just grading it manually. Now this is a factor that you have to consider if you're looking at cameras such as these and you're thinking of shooting an S-Log to try and get the maximum dynamic range out of your shot. And that is actually, I didn't actually enjoy using the S-Log or shooting in the S-Log format because I found it tricky to expose and judge, and a couple of times I actually missed focus because of the monitor resolution is not great, even though I had peaking, zebras and the histogram going on the camera. I much prefer to shoot with picture profiles where what you see is what you get, and that's why the monitor LUT helped me a little bit more when shooting in the S-Log, and that's why I prefer shooting on my Panasonic with that Cine D, because what you're shooting is generally what you get, so therefore I find it a lot easier to judge exposure that way. And of course that is another factor to consider if you intend in shooting an S-Log or some sort of log format, is that it's going to take you longer in your post-production editing workflow. And of course, does your editing computer, or can it handle these larger files? So I was shooting in 10-bit 422 and these are very large files, so therefore I need a lot more disk storage, and I actually had to transfer, and I still do if I'm shooting any type of 4K footage. To edit it, I have to transfer all the files to my computer's hard drive and edit directly off the computer's hard drive to maintain speed and ease, or stop it being so sticky and jittery when I'm editing. And I couldn't, for example, edit 4K files off an external USB hard drive, especially this type where the speed is just not fast enough. Now the Sony A7 III has improved color reproduction off its sensor, and I did a couple of test shots here. You can see where I shot with no picture profiles, and this is just the native picture format that the camera uses, and I actually think it looks pretty good. It's also hard to go past that full frame look that these cameras can give you, coupled with this very good 16-35 f2.8 lens. My GH5 with its micro 4/3 image sensor just can't give me that full frame look, especially if I'm using a shallow depth of field. Now the one main benefit I would buy a Sony A7S series camera for would be its low light shooting capability. So this is where the Sony A7S series really shines. It is 10 past 10 at night here, and I am just under a street lamp as my only illumination. I mean, it is kind of a very late light down here, but man, 12,800 ISO, I'm reading off that. Looks good. As a real estate video shooter, you will often find yourself in low light shooting situations on the interior of properties. So having a camera with an amazing ISO range is a fantastic tool or function to have in a camera, and it can get you out of some sticky situations where you're having to, for example, try not to have your lens wide open at f2.8, which is giving you too much of a shallow depth of field, or having to lift your ISO too high that your image starts breaking down. Now the new Sony A7S Mark III has apparently a dual ISO functionality, and with my limited understanding, I believe what that does is it gives the camera two different sensitivity levels when changing your ISO. I found that you have to still treat your low ISO settings up to about 3200 as you would any camera such as my GH5, and for example you see in some of these shots that the ISO 6400 is actually quite noisy. However, when you hit ISO 12,800 the sensitivity jumps up and the image cleans up, and it is a fantastic, clean and amazing low light setting to use this camera in. This camera takes low light shooting situations in its stride, and it's fantastic to have that capability in a camera for these specific styles of shooting, and it didn't disappoint me. Handling and usability. Now having all these wonderful video specs and image quality is all very well, but it can be severely handicapped if the camera is not quick and easy or intuitive to use. Never underestimate the importance of basically the handling and usability of a camera when looking at a new system. For example, is it easy to adjust your aperture with the dials? Has it got readily and easily accessible dials for changing your aperture or your ISO, or perhaps tweaking your frame rates? My philosophy on this is that when using cameras, their control should be intuitive and easy to use and become second nature. You should be concentrating on what's happening in front of your lens and not fiddling with your camera and figuring out menus and buttons. And I have to say I found the Sony A7S III functionality and form factor good to use. It's solid, chunky, it has a really nice big handle and secure grip and easy access to the essential dials and buttons. And again, as you'd expect with a camera in this price point, it has a lot of customizable buttons, so you can customize menu functions and buttons on the camera for the video functionality that you may want to use or change when shooting. Also, I have to say I'm a fan of the flip out LCD monitors as opposed to its predecessor, which had the flip up one. So yeah, I like it, and perhaps I'm biased because I'm so used to using them now. And speaking of the monitor, it has a limited touchscreen LCD monitor, and it has a touch to focus, which I really quite like, and I find it fast and efficient to use, where you can use the touchscreen to set your focus and lock your focus on your area of interest. And I use it all the time on this camera and my GH5 when shooting. However, if you are new to Sony, you may find the menus and the menus within the menus a little bit confusing, and it takes you a little while to dial into them, and I'm getting quite used to them now, but that can be a little bit overwhelming for those new perhaps to the Sony ecosystem. And again, with regards to the form factor, it's nice and compact and very similar in size to my GH5, so it's slotted straight onto my Moza gimbal. This lens actually is a little bit bigger and heavier, so I actually had it right at the back of the gimbal, but it still worked on my existing gimbal, which is a factor to consider if you are looking at changing camera systems. Having the ability to shoot 4K up to 120 frames a second internally is fantastic, but I can show you exactly no examples, and this is because you need a higher spec memory card, which I didn't have, and it was an oversight on my part. However, I could shoot 4K 50 frames a second on my existing memory cards, which is all I actually needed. It would have been great to show some 4K 100 frames per second goodness though. And speaking of memory cards, to shoot these ultra high frame rates and image quality, you need, I'm just going to check my notes over here, the SD UHS 2 cards or CF Express Type A cards, which obviously I don't have. And another variable to consider is lenses. The Sony A7S obviously uses the Sony E-mount lenses, so if I was going to jump ship from my Panasonic system, I would need to buy all new lenses. And speaking of lenses, the Sony 16 to 35 f2.8 G-mount lens is a beautiful piece of glass, and that comes in at a price which I'll again refer to my notes, and that comes in at US just under $2,000 US. However, it is a very nice piece of glass coupled with this body. If you're just a real estate shooter and you're on a budget, then I think you could save some money and just use the f4 16 to 35 lens, because you have ISO to play with on your camera, so having an f2.8 is not such a big penalty for that style of shooting. Now, speaking of price, like a lot of good things in life, they don't come cheap. And at the time of recording this, the Sony A7S Mark III body was US $3,498 or New Zealand $6,798. That's a fair chunk of change. To wrap it up, there is no doubt that this camera, with its amazing video functionality and low light shooting prowess, is a video shooting monster, and it's one of those cameras that will grow and get better and better the more that you use it and dial into figuring out the best settings and way to operate it. Like most new camera or gear purchases, it again will depend on your budget and whether it fits in with your workflow, and you are the only one that can make that decision. And as always, if you need any help in learning to shoot real estate styles of video, I'll leave a link below to my 9 best tips for shooting real estate video. So thanks for watching, and I will see you in the next video.